In the heart of a city that never seemed to pause for breath, tucked away between the cold glass of office towers and the warm aroma of coffee shops, there was a small, forgotten park. It wasn't a park of manicured lawns and blooming flower beds, but a humble patch of green with a few worn benches and several concrete tables. These tables were its main feature, their surfaces permanently etched with the faint, ghostly squares of chessboards. They were the silent battlegrounds for a small, dedicated tribe of thinkers, hustlers, and dreamers. And among them all, there was one player who stood apart. A 16-year-old girl named Maya. To the hurried passersby, she was just another teenager, often seen with a backpack slung over one shoulder and headphones in her ears, lost in her own world. But in this small corner of the park, she was a quiet legend. Maya had learned the game not from expensive coaches or thick, dusty books, but from the gentle hands of her late grandfather. He hadn't taught her with complex theories or memorized openings. Instead, he'd told her stories. "The knight is a brave explorer, Maya," he would say, his voice warm and raspy. "It jumps over others. It sees the world differently. The bishop is a priest, moving with purpose along its chosen path. And the pawns. Oh, the pawns are the soul of the game. Small and seemingly weak, but they hold the promise of becoming anything they want to be." He taught her to see the board not as a puzzle to be solved, but as a living, breathing story unfolding with every move. When he passed away, the chessboard became her connection to him, a place where his voice still echoed in her mind. Her style of play was a direct reflection of his lessons. It was raw, intuitive, and fiercely aggressive. The old men who frequented the park, the ones who had been playing for 50 years, would shake their heads in disbelief. She didn't play the correct moves they read about in their newspapers. She played moves that felt right, moves that were daring and often baffling. A pawn would march forward with no apparent support, only to become a thorn in the enemy's side 3 moves later. A knight would be sacrificed for a seemingly small advantage, an advantage that would suddenly snowball into an unstoppable attack. They called her the Park Phantom because she could appear out of nowhere, sit down at a table, and dismantle the most confident of players with a quiet, unnerving focus. Her world was small, confined to these scarred concrete tables and the view from her bedroom window. She knew the names of the Grandmasters from the internet, the giants who played in gleaming tournaments in far-off cities. She would watch their games on a cracked phone screen, her heart pounding with a mixture of awe and longing. She saw the precision, the deep calculation, the polished elegance of their play, and she dreamed. But dreaming was as far as it went. Tournaments cost money. Coaches cost money. Traveling to a different city was an unimaginable luxury. Her reality was school, homework, and the daily pilgrimage to her concrete arena. It was here in this small world that she was a queen. Outside of it, she felt invisible. One crisp autumn afternoon, the park was buzzing with its usual quiet energy. The smell of roasted nuts from a street cart mingled with the scent of damp earth. A man in a crisp suit, clearly on his lunch break, was being soundly beaten by a grizzled old-timer who looked like he hadn't owned a suit in his life. Maya sat at her usual table, waiting. Across from her was a man known only as Silas. Silas was a hustler. He played for a few dollars a game, his face a mask of concentration broken only by the occasional sly grin when he sprang a trap. He had seen Maya play before and had always avoided her table, preferring easier targets. But today the pickings were slim, and his pride was getting the better of him. "Hey kid," he grunted, gesturing to the empty chair. "Fancy a real game? $10 says I have you in checkmate in 20 moves." A small crowd of the regulars began to gather. They knew Maya's reputation, and they knew Silas's ego. This was going to be good. Maya simply nodded, pulling a well-worn roll-up chessboard from her backpack. The pieces were plastic, a bit chipped, but they were hers. She set them up with practiced efficiency, her fingers dancing over the board. Silas played his usual opening, a sharp, aggressive line designed to quickly overwhelm a less experienced player. He expected Maya to retreat, to get defensive. Instead, she did the opposite. Her knight leaped to the edge of the board, a strange, provocative move that seemed to ignore the center of the action entirely. Silas chuckled. "Amateur move," he muttered, capturing one of her central pawns. But Maya's eyes weren't on the pawn she had just lost. They were fixed on a distant corner of the board, a place where her strange knight move was now creating a tiny, almost invisible threat. The game continued. Silas built up his attack, his pieces marching towards Maya's king with menacing intent. The onlookers started to murmur, thinking the girl was in trouble. But Maya remained calm, her expression unreadable. She made her moves quickly, almost casually, as if she were simply doodling. With each of Silas's powerful advances, she would make a small, quiet, seemingly insignificant reply. A pawn slid one square forward. A bishop shuffled to a safer diagonal. A rook lifted off the back rank. Silas was getting frustrated. He was throwing everything he had at her, and she wasn't even flinching. He felt like he was punching a cloud. "Come on, kid, fight back," he snarled, making a particularly aggressive move that left his own king slightly exposed. It was the moment she had been waiting for. For the first time in the game, a small smile touched Maya's lips. It wasn't a smirk of arrogance, but a smile of pure understanding. The story her grandfather had taught her to see was now clear. Her quiet moves, the ones Silas had ignored, had all been part of a grand design. They were the threads of a net, and now the net was about to close. Her rook, which had been sitting patiently on the back rank, now slid to an open file. It was a simple, quiet move. But to anyone who could truly see the board, it was a thunderclap. Silas stared at the board, his confident smirk finally melting away. He saw it then. The trap. It wasn't one move, but a combination of 5 of her insignificant moves, all working together. His king was trapped. There was no escape. He looked up at Maya, his eyes wide with disbelief. The small crowd of old men was silent, their faces filled with admiration. They had seen it happen before, but it never got old. Silas slowly reached out and tipped his king over. He didn't say a word. He just pulled a $10 bill from his wallet, placed it on the table, and walked away, a visibly shaken man. Maya packed up her board, the $10 left untouched. She didn't play for money. She played for the story, for the feeling of the pieces coming alive in her hands. As she shouldered her backpack and walked out of the park, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an alert from a local chess club she followed. The city's annual chess festival was announced. The main event, a simultaneous exhibition with the famous Grandmaster Haroic. And for the first time ever, 30 spots were open to the public, chosen by a preliminary qualifying tournament. Maya stopped walking, the city noise fading into a dull hum. She stared at the poster on her phone screen. It was a world away from her park, a world of bright lights and famous names. It was a world she thought was impossible. But for the first time, she saw a door, a tiny crack of a doorway that might just be big enough for her to slip through. The news of the chess festival spread through the city like a warm front. Posters appeared on bus shelters and in library windows, featuring a sharp, confident-looking man with a smile that was both charming and a little bit dangerous. This was Grandmaster Haroic. He wasn't just a player. He was a celebrity known for his speed, his showmanship, and a brain that worked faster than a supercomputer. He was the kind of person who made chess look cool, turning quiet, intellectual battles into thrilling public performances. For Maya, seeing his face on a poster felt surreal. He was a creature from a different universe, the one she only visited on her phone screen. The idea of being in the same room as him, let alone playing against him, was terrifying and exhilarating all at once. The qualifying tournament was held in a community hall, a far cry from the grand venue of the main festival, but it was a step up from the park. The air was thick with the scent of floor polish and nervous energy. There were no concrete tables here, only proper wooden boards and heavy tournament standard pieces. Maya felt a pang of insecurity. Her world of chipped plastic and scarred concrete suddenly felt very small and amateurish. The other competitors were mostly serious men, much older than her, who talked in a language of openings and variations she had only read about. They carried their own fancy chess clocks and leather-bound scorebooks. Maya just had her backpack and a quiet determination. The The tournament was a series of fast-paced blitz games where each player only had 5 minutes on their clock. This was Maya's element. There was no time for deep textbook calculations. You had to rely on instinct, on feeling the flow of the game. This was her grandfather's chess. She moved from board to board, her mind clear. She ignored the whispers about the young girl who had entered, and she didn't look at the faces of her opponents. She just saw the pieces. She saw the stories they wanted to tell. Her knight would leap into a seemingly suicidal attack, creating chaos that her opponents, used to orderly games, couldn't handle. Her pawns would advance with a fearless unity, forming a wall that was as psychological as it was physical. One by one, her opponents fell. They would shake their heads, not in anger, but in a sort of bewildered respect. They had been outthought, not by a machine, but by a force of nature. When the final results were posted, Maya's name was at the top of the list. She had done it. She had one of the 30 spots to face the Grandmaster. The day of the festival felt like a dream. The venue was a massive conference center, gleaming and modern. The main hall was filled with rows of tables, each with a pristine chessboard set up under bright lights. A hushed reverence filled the space like a cathedral for thinkers. Maya felt completely out of place in her simple jeans and sweater, surrounded by people in blazers and formal wear. She found her designated board, a small placard with her name on it. The pieces were beautiful, heavy and carved with an elegance that made her feel like she should be wearing gloves to touch them. She sat down, her heart hammering against her ribs, and tried to make herself small. Then he arrived. A ripple of applause and excitement went through the crowd. Grandmaster Eris Thorne walked in, flanked by event organizers. He was even more impressive in person. He wore a tailored suit, and his eyes scanned the room with an easy confidence. He waved to the crowd, a practiced, charismatic gesture that drew cheers. He was a performer, and this was his stage. He began the simultaneous exhibition, moving from board to board with a fluid, almost lazy grace. He would make a move, sometimes without even seeming to look at the board for more than a second, and then glide to the next one. One by one, his opponents would crumble. Maya watched him, mesmerized. He was so different from the park players. There was no hesitation, no doubt. His moves were precise, economical, and deadly. He was dismantling some of the city's best players as if he were solving a simple crossword puzzle. The crowd followed him, a murmuring tide of admirers. Maya's turn was coming. She felt a knot of dread and excitement tighten in her stomach. What would he say when he saw her? Would he dismiss her just like everyone else had at the qualifying tournament? Finally, he arrived at her board. He paused for a moment, his eyes taking her in. A flicker of something surprise, maybe, or just curiosity, crossed his face before his charming smile returned. "Well, hello," he said, his voice smooth and carrying easily to the people gathered around. "Our youngest competitor. It's a brave thing to do, to sit here and face the music." The crowd chuckled softly. Maya felt her face get hot. She just nodded, not trusting her voice. He glanced down at her opening move. She had played a strange, aggressive pawn push, a move not found in any standard chess book. It was a move born in the park, a move that shouted, "I'm coming for you." The Grandmaster's smile widened. He let out a small theatrical sigh. "Ah, the romantic's opening," he announced to the crowd, his voice laced with condescension. "Full of passion, full of fire, but passion burns out quickly in the face of cold, hard logic. A very brave choice." The chuckles from the crowd were a little louder this time. They were laughing with him, at her. The heat in Maya's cheeks turned into a burning sting of humiliation. She felt small, like an imposter who had been found out. All her doubts came rushing back. She didn't belong here. She was just a park player who had gotten lucky. But then she looked down at the board. She saw the pieces, her soldiers, waiting for her command. She remembered her grandfather's voice. "The board doesn't care who you are, Maya. It only cares about the truth of your moves." In that moment, something inside her shifted. The embarrassment hardened into a quiet, steely resolve. She would not be a joke. She would not be a lesson. She would be a problem. As the Grandmaster started to turn away, already thinking about his next board, Maya reached out and moved a piece. It was her knight. She slid it to a square, where it was completely exposed. A sitting duck for one of his pawns. It was a shocking move. A sacrifice. To a casual observer, it looked like a terrible blunder, a gift. But to a Grandmaster, a move like that was a question. A very, very dangerous question. Eris Thorn stopped mid-turn. His body froze. The charming smile vanished from his face, replaced by a look of intense focus. He slowly turned back to the board, his eyes narrowing. He saw the trap. It wasn't a simple trap. It was a complex, multi-layered idea. By sacrificing her knight, she was opening up lines of attack for her other pieces, weaving a web around his king that was almost invisible. It was the kind of wild, beautiful, and terrifying idea that you couldn't prepare for. It was pure, unfiltered intuition. He stared at the board for a full 10 seconds. A lifetime for a man who usually took seconds for an entire game. The murmur of the crowd died down. They could feel the change in the atmosphere. The performance had stopped. This was no longer an exhibition. Thorn looked up from the board and directly at Maya, really looking at her for the first time. He saw not a nervous kid, but a pair of eyes that were clear, calm, and full of a fierce intelligence that took him completely by surprise. He let out a slow breath. Then, to everyone's astonishment, he pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down. "All right, young lady," he said, his voice now devoid of its Baoyanja-esque charm. It was low, serious, and filled with a new kind of respect. "Let's play." The entire hall fell silent. All eyes were now fixed on one single board, where the teenage girl from the park had just issued a challenge that even a Grandmaster couldn't ignore. The moment Grandmaster Eris Thorn sat down, the air in the vast hall changed. It was as if someone had flipped a switch, turning a light-hearted show into a deadly, serious duel. The low murmur of the crowd, the distant clicks of the other 29 games,
all of it,
faded into a profound, electric silence. This was no longer an exhibition. It was a confrontation. The charming performer was gone, and in his place was a predator, his eyes fixed on his prey. But Maya didn't feel like prey. The sting of his public condescension had burned away her nervousness, leaving behind a core of pure, cold focus. She wasn't facing a Grandmaster. She was facing a puzzle, a story that needed to be finished, and she was the one holding the pen. For the first few moves, a tense dance unfolded. Eris, now playing with his full attention, tried to steer the game back into familiar territory. He made precise, logical moves attempting to simplify the position, to tame the wild chaos Maya had created with her knight's sacrifice. He was trying to build a fortress, to wall off his king, and launch a methodical counterattack. It was the kind of chess he had mastered, the kind that had made him a champion. But Maya refused to play his game. Every time he tried to build a wall, she would find a tiny crack to slip through. She didn't attack his fortress head-on. She undermined its foundations. She made quiet, subtle moves that seemed to do nothing at all. A pawn would inch forward one square. A bishop would shift to a slightly different diagonal. To the untrained eye, it looked like she was losing ground, that the Grandmaster's superior logic was slowly squeezing the life out of her position. But a few people in the crowd, the real chess players, began to see something else. They started to whisper, "Look at that rook." One would murmur to another, "It's doing nothing now, but it controls the entire open file." "Her queen is on the other side of the board, but it's staring right at his king," someone else would point out. They were seeing the invisible threads of Maya's attack, a web she was weaving so slowly and patiently that the Grandmaster himself didn't seem to notice it being spun around him. Eris grew more and more frustrated. He was used to opponents reacting to him, to their plans crumbling under the pressure of his attacks. Maya was different. She was like water, flowing around his pieces, always finding the path of least resistance. He felt like he was trying to catch smoke with his bare hands. The crowd swelled around their table. The other 28 games, now forgotten, were left in various states of abandonment as players and spectators alike drifted towards the center of the hall. They formed a silent, concentric circle, a living amphitheater for the unexpected drama. Phones, held discreetly at first, were now held openly, their screens recording the historic battle. The glow of the screens cast a pale, ethereal light on the faces in the crowd, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and awe. Maya remained oblivious to it all. Her world had shrunk to the 64 squares in front of her. She wasn't thinking about strategy or tactics in the way Eris was. She was feeling the game. She could sense the tension in the pieces, the potential energy coiled and ready to be released. She saw the board not as a set of problems, but as a living landscape. Her pieces weren't just wood and plastic. They were her companions, each with a role to play in the story she was telling. The story was reaching its climax. Eris, his patience worn thin, decided to force the issue. He made a bold, aggressive move. A powerful knight thrust that was designed to shatter her position and finally seize control of the game. It was a move that screamed, "I am the Grandmaster, and you will bow to my will." A collective gasp went through the crowd. It looked like a decisive, crushing blow. For a moment, it seemed the story was over. But Maya didn't flinch. She had seen this coming. In fact, she had been counting on it. His aggressive move, born from frustration, had left a tiny, almost invisible weakness in his own defenses. It was like a fortress with one single loose stone, and Maya knew exactly where to push. She didn't respond with a counterattack. She didn't try to block his knight. Instead, she made the quietest, most unassuming move of the entire game. She simply moved her king one square to the side. It was a move that made no sense to most of the onlookers. It looked passive, even weak. Why move your king when your opponent is launching an all-out assault? Eris himself frowned, confused by the move. He scanned the board, looking for the hidden trap, but he couldn't see it. He saw his knight, a dominant force in the center of the board. He saw his powerful pieces, all poised to strike. He couldn't see the danger. He decided the girl had made a mistake. He pressed his attack, moving another piece forward to tighten the screws on her position. And that's when he saw it. It wasn't one thing. It was everything. Her quiet moves, her ignored pawn pushes, her passive King Mavet had all been part of a single brilliant, terrifying idea. His own aggressive move, the one he thought was his masterpiece, had been the final key she needed to unlock her attack. The loose stone in his fortress had just caused the entire wall to collapse. The color drained from Maurice's face. His confident posture slumped. He saw the checkmate looming, not in one move, but in an unstoppable cascade of moves that he could do nothing to stop. His pieces, which had seemed so powerful just seconds ago, were now clumsy, helpless spectators to their own king's demise. He looked up from the board, his eyes wide with a dawning horror. He looked at Maya, searching her face for some sign of triumph, some smugness, but there was none. Her expression was the same as it had been from the beginning, calm, focused, serene. She wasn't happy she was winning. She was just satisfied that the story was reaching its proper conclusion. The storm had broken. The web had closed. The girl from the park had done the impossible. She had taken the master of logic and defeated him with the pure, unteachable language of intuition. The world seemed to slow down for Grandmaster Eris Thorn. The faces in the crowd blurred into a meaningless swirl of color. The bright lights of the conference hall felt dim and distant. His entire universe, all his years of study, all his victories, all his confidence, had shrunk to the 64 squares of wood in front of him. He was no longer seeing individual pieces. He was seeing a pattern, a devastatingly beautiful and terrifying pattern that he had walked into blindly. The checkmate wasn't just a possibility. It was a certainty. It was as inevitable as the sun rising. He replayed the last 10 moves in his mind, not as a grandmaster analyzing a game, but as a student trying to understand a lesson from a master for his superior. He saw her knight's sacrifice, the move he had dismissed as romantic foolishness. It wasn't a sacrifice. It was an investment. It had been the key that unlocked the position. He saw her quiet pawn moves, the ones he had ignored as he built his own attack. They weren't passive. They were the slow, steady creep of a rising tide, cutting off his escape routes one by one. And then he saw her final quiet king move, the one that had looked so weak, so passive. It was the final brilliant brushstroke on a masterpiece. It had been the move that sealed his fate, creating an unbreakable net around his king with a piece he thought was running for its life. A cold knot formed in his stomach. His own words from the beginning of the game came back to haunt him, echoing in the silence of his mind. The romantic's opening. Passion burns out quickly in the face of cold, hard logic. He couldn't have been more wrong. Her passion hadn't burned out. It had forged a new kind of logic, a logic that his cold, calculated mind couldn't comprehend. He had been the one who was rigid, the one who was trapped by his own knowledge. She had been free, and her freedom had defeated him. He felt a strange mix of emotions. There was the sting of humiliation, of course. The public nature of this defeat made it burn, but beneath that, there was something else. Awe, a deep, profound respect for the mind sitting across from him. This wasn't luck. This was not a fluke. This was genius. Raw, untrained, once-in-a-generation genius. He slowly lifted his gaze from the board and looked at her again. She was just sitting there, her hands resting calmly in her lap, her expression as serene as a still lake. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't even smiling. She was just waiting. Waiting for him to see what she had seen all along. In that moment, he understood. She wasn't playing to beat him. She was playing to find the truth of the game. And the truth was that his king was dead. The silence in the hall had become a physical thing. It was heavy, pressing down on everyone present. The crowd, which had been a living, breathing entity just moments before, was now frozen. They could feel the tension radiating from the center table, the silent battle of wills that had reached its conclusion. They didn't need to be Grandmasters to know that something extraordinary had just happened. They saw the look on Eris Thorne's face, a look they had never seen before. It was the look of a man who had just seen a ghost. For Maya, the world was quiet and simple. The board was a clear picture. The path to the end was a straight line. She wasn't thinking about the crowd or the Grandmaster, or what this victory might mean. She was just feeling the harmony of her pieces. They were working together, a perfect team, and their job was almost done. She could feel the story her grandfather had taught her about reaching its final, perfect chapter. The brave knight, the purposeful bishop, and the soul of the game, the pawns, had all played their part. Now, it was time for the king to fall. Eris raised his hand. It felt heavy, as if it were made of lead. The cameras in the crowd zoomed in, capturing the tremor in his fingers. He moved it slowly, deliberately, over the board. Every eye in the room followed his hand. Time seemed to stretch into infinity. He reached his king, the most important piece on the board. The symbol of his power, and with a gentle nudge of his fingers, he tipped it over on its side. The king fell with a soft final clack against the wooden board. It was a small sound, but in the profound silence of the hall, it sounded like a thunderclap. It was the sound that broke the spell. For a full 5 seconds after the king fell, no one moved. No one spoke. The silence stretched, becoming almost unbearable. It was the silence of a collective gasp, of 100 minds processing the impossible. The great Eris Thorne, the man who made chess look easy, had been defeated. Not just defeated, but dismantled. And he had been defeated by a girl no one had ever heard of. Then, from the back of the crowd, a single person started to clap. It was a slow, deliberate clap, full of meaning. Then, another person joined in, and another. It was like the first few drops of rain before a storm. Then, all at once, the dam broke. The entire hall erupted in a thunderous, deafening ovation. The applause was not just polite, it was explosive. It was a roar of pure, unadulterated awe. People were on their feet, cheering, whistling, their faces alight with excitement. They were not just applauding a victory. They were witnessing history. They were celebrating the moment when the underdog, the unknown girl from the park, had slayed the giant. The sound washed over Maya, pulling her out of her trance. She looked up, startled, as if waking from a dream. She saw the hundreds of people on their feet, all of them clapping for her. She saw the phones, the lights, the sea of faces. For the first time, she seemed to realize the magnitude of what she had just done. A slow blush spread across her cheeks, and a look of wide-eyed wonder replaced her calm focus. She had not just won a game of chess. She had stepped into a new world, and in doing so, had shocked everyone in it. The sound that filled the vast hall was not just noise, it was a physical force. It was a wave of pure emotion, a tidal wave of shock, admiration, and sheer disbelief that crashed over Maya, leaving her breathless. She had been in her own quiet world, a world of 64 squares and silent pieces. And now she was violently thrust into a universe of roaring crowds and blinding lights. Her first instinct was to shrink, to make herself as small as possible, to disappear back into the anonymity she had always known. She looked down at the fallen king, the simple wooden piece that had just caused this incredible explosion. It was her anchor, the one thing in the room that still made sense. The applause showed no sign of stopping. It grew louder, more insistent. People were not just clapping. They were standing on their chairs, shouting her name, a name that, until today, most of them had never even heard. It was too much. Maya felt a panic rising in her chest, the kind of panic you feel when you're lost in a crowd and can't find a familiar face. She wanted to run, to grab her backpack, and flee back to the quiet safety of her park. But she was trapped in the center of a hurricane of attention. Then, a movement broke through the wall of sound. Grandmaster Thorn, the man who had just been publicly dethroned, rose from his seat. The crowd's roar softened slightly, turning into a murmur of curiosity. What would he do? Would he storm off in anger? Would he make an excuse? He did none of those things. He stood tall, his face no longer a mask of shock, but a picture of profound respect. He looked down at Maya, not as a defeated opponent, but as an equal. Then, he did something that stunned the crowd into a new, deeper silence. He reached across the board, his hand extended in a gesture of sportsmanship and honor. Maya looked up at his hand, then at his face. She saw no anger, no bitterness, only a genuine, heartfelt admiration. Hesitantly, she reached out her own hand and took his. His grip was firm and warm. He held her hand for a moment longer than a normal handshake, a silent communication passing between them. It was a moment of shared understanding, a master acknowledging a new kind of genius. An organizer, seeing the moment, quickly handed Aris a microphone. He cleared his throat, and the amplified sound echoed through the now silent hall. "I came here today to put on a show," he began, his voice steady and clear, carrying none of its earlier arrogance. "I came to share my love for this game, to maybe teach a few people a thing or two." He paused, a small wry smile playing on his lips. "But I've just been taught the most important lesson of my career." The crowd was utterly captivated. This was not the script they had expected. "I made a mistake at the beginning of this game," he continued, his eyes finding Maya's. "I saw a young player, and I saw an opening that was unconventional. I called it romantic, and I dismissed it. I was arrogant. I was foolish." He turned to face the crowd, his expression serious. "What I just witnessed was not romantic chess. It was not amateur chess. It was the most brilliant, most intuitive, most alive game I have ever had the honor of playing. This young lady," he said, gesturing to Maya, "does not play by the book. She plays with her heart, with a fearless creativity that you cannot teach, that you cannot study. She sees the game in a way that I, with all my years of study and experience, can only dream of." He looked back at Maya, and his voice softened. "The world needs to see your talent. It would be a crime for it to remain hidden in a park, and I am going to do everything in my power to make sure that doesn't happen." With that, he handed the microphone back and gave Maya a final, respectful nod before walking away from the table, leaving her alone in the center of the storm. The applause that followed was even louder than before, but this time it was different. It wasn't just for a shocking victory. It was for the Grandmaster's incredible humility and for the girl who had inspired it. In the hours that followed, the story of the game escaped the confines of the hall. The dozens of phone recordings taken by people in the crowd began to appear online. They spread like wildfire. The titles were dramatic and sensational. Unknown Girl Destroys Grandmaster. The Checkmate That Broke the Internet. Park Phantom's Revenge. Chess forums exploded with activity. Grandmasters from around the world weighed in, analyzing the game move by move. Some were skeptical, claiming it must have been a fluke, a lucky blunder by the Grandmaster. But the more they analyzed, the more they were amazed. They saw the depth of Maya's ideas, the subtle brilliance of her quiet moves. They couldn't find a single mistake in her play. They started using words like genius, prodigy, and once in a generation. Her style was given a name, organic chess. It was raw, unstructured, and beautiful. For Maya, the next few days were a blur. She went home, back to her small room, and tried to pretend it was all a dream. But her phone, which used to be silent for days, would not stop buzzing. It started with emails from local news outlets. Then came requests for interviews from national magazines. Then came the calls that changed everything. The first was from a prestigious chess academy in another country. They had seen the videos. They were offering her a full scholarship, covering everything's tuition, travel, and living expenses. It was an opportunity she never could have imagined, a ticket to the world she had only ever seen on her cracked phone screen. The second call was the one that truly convinced her it was real. It was Grandmaster Eris Thorne himself. "I told you I would help," he said, his voice warm and friendly on the other end of the line. "I've spoken to the academy. I'll be your personal mentor. We'll make sure you have everything you need." He wasn't just making a grand gesture in front of a crowd. He was keeping his promise. A few weeks later, with a new suitcase and a heart full of nervous excitement, Maya stood in her small park one last time before her flight. The air smelled the same, of damp earth and roasted nuts. The old men were at their tables, the same kings of their small concrete kingdom. She walked over to her usual table. Silas, the hustler who had once sneered at her, was there. He looked up at her, a look of pure respect in his eyes. "So you're really leaving," he said, not as a question but as a statement. Maya just nodded. "Go show 'em how we play in the park," he said with a gruff smile. Maya smiled back. She looked at the worn-out table, at the faint ghostly squares etched into its surface. This was where it all began. This was where her grandfather's voice still lived, in the quiet language of the pieces. She had not just won a game. She had honored his memory. She had taken the simple, pure love he had taught her and used it to open a door to a future she could never have dreamed of. The girl from the park was about to step onto the world stage. But she knew in her heart that she would always carry the quiet strength of those concrete tables with her. The game had just begun.